Thank you all for coming this morning. My name is Wade Ellery. I'm with Radiant Logic, and I want to talk to you today about living in a hybrid world and moving your current environment to the cloud. And this is an area where we've seen a tremendous transformation in the identity space starting about 7 or 8 years ago. It's actually odd for me to think back how long ago I heard cloud the first time mentioned and didn't understand it was not a weather reference in that scenario, but actually a transformation of the whole way we approach identity management and we approach technology itself in the IT stack. But getting to the cloud and living in a hybrid world is akin to planning a wedding or moving from one home to another or going on a vacation. There's a tremendous amount of logistics involved in lifting up everything you have and moving it to a whole new world. And what I want to talk about today is really sort of a checklist for you to take with you on things to think about, things to know, things to understand in terms of what going to the cloud really means, what living in a hybrid world brings with it in terms of challenges and benefits, and some other things to think about as you move forward. But part of what happened when the cloud was sort of introduced, initially when people started talking about the cloud, and I was with a startup at the time that was building cloud applications, we were told, no one's going to put secure information in the cloud. Just go home. We're all going to stay in our data centers. This is just a fad. But it has turned out to be anything but that. And now there's more critical information in cloud infrastructures now than there probably is in data centers in some companies. But the promise of it being rainbows and unicorns is a little overstated. The idea of the cloud is really just your information on someone else's machines in someone else's building managed by somebody else. Very much akin to daycare. You love your data, you care for it, you think about it every day, but you really have other things you got to do, so you hand it to someone else and you come back at 5 o'clock hoping they fed it and didn't let it fall down and skin its knee. Well, that works really well until there's a water leak at the daycare center and all your kids end up in wet clothes. Or Salesforce has a patch that runs awry and shuts down their whole West Coast operations for people that use certain products. Or Microsoft itself ends up with a challenge. So the issue here was at Salesforce, access to customer support and tracking case information was not accessible. Pricing and quoting systems stopped working. Contact and prospect information was unavailable. And access to customer history and contact stopped. So if you're in the sales space or you know people in the sales organization, imagine if you just basically told them, give me your laptop, you'll get it back at the end of the day. By the way, be productive and make sure everything your customers need gets handled. It was a bit of a traumatic experience for people who weren't used to not having access. But that's what happens when you let your stuff go to somebody else and let them manage it. This is another example of Microsoft actually losing their East Coast Visual Studio platform. This is Microsoft's own data hosting of their own application that they were servicing that was down for 2 days. This caused a lot of internal application developers not to be able to do any work because everything was in that cloud system. So I'm not saying the cloud's a bad place to go. I'm just saying be aware that it's not unicorns and rainbows. It is just servers. It's hardware. It's people patching things and making mistakes. Have contingency plans out the door just so you have a way of operating if you have to, if there is a model for that. That's not always the case though, because in a lot of situations going to the cloud is in some ways an all or nothing move. You don't end up running 2 CRM systems. You're not in Siebel and Salesforce just in case Salesforce is down for an afternoon. But you have to be able to understand that's still a possibility. The idea that you've outsourced it to someone else and it's their problem doesn't mean problems won't happen. So if you're moving to the cloud, there's 4 basic questions to ask right up front. Which cloud are you moving to? Because when you say cloud, it's almost like you want to go to dinner. Yeah, well, what kind of food do you want? Do you want Italian? Do you want Chinese? How about sushi? Do you feel like some Russian? It's all sorts of variations. And in the cloud space, we have SaaS applications. Now, SaaS applications is sort of the original idea of the cloud. I'm going to give all my information to a third party. They're going to host that in a multi-tenant environment. That means my data is in a data center and other servers with other people. And these are about the 16 or 17 largest SaaS applications out there right now. This is a wonderful model. I started with Salesforce when they originally released their product, probably 15 years ago. And it's been a great boon for easy access to data and being able to source that. Zendesk, if you don't want to spin up a help desk organization, gives you a real powerful tool for that. This is one part of going to the cloud, but this is not the only cloud scenario out there. And in this one, in many situations, is done outside of IT. People go ahead and pull out a credit card, open up a Salesforce account, start copying data up into Salesforce, and IT doesn't even necessarily know that's happening. So there's a number of systems in place now to sort of trap that data as it's leaving the organization. But there are models here in this particular scenario that you need to be aware of in terms of just application hosting, provisioning those endpoint applications. But there's also IDaaS. IDaaS is Identity as a Service, and this is the one that's gotten the most press right now, and some of the biggest unicorns in terms of IPOs, Okta recently in terms of their jump onto the market, and really came from an SMB play to being the major IDaaS solution. And IDaaS is the concept of I'm going to take my identity infrastructure, I'm going to host that in the cloud. I'm not hosting just my data in someone's application. I'm hosting my user identity information in someone else's servers in somebody else's building. And because they have invested a lot in building really cool tools and they're managing the infrastructure and they're holding up the data, I'm going to have a lot of advantages in that over the on-premise integration. And the second half of this model is, especially for Azure and for Okta, they're providing a gateway to single sign-on into those first SaaS applications that we looked at. If I have a Salesforce and a Concur and a ServiceNow, those are all cloud-based applications using SAML for authentication. Okta, Azure, PingOne can manage that SAML model for you, so now one identity can authenticate once, log in everywhere across the cloud, and all that works really well. A bit of a challenge, though, when you try and use that identity to log back on to on-premise applications that are still using LDAP or some local Microsoft security models, and there's sort of plugins and workarounds for that. But a key piece here is, if I'm going cloud, if I'm moving up into the cloud, would it make sense to take my identities with me? And that question is really answered by where are your customers, where are your consumers, where are your employees coming from, and where are your applications? If most of your people are on buildings you own, on your backbone network, most of the applications they run are still internal, big SAP shop, lots of local Oracle financials. Pushing them up to the cloud to authenticate and bringing them back down into your building to access the application is two trips that really don't make a lot of sense. But if your user workforce is all mobile, everyone's mobile sales, they're on laptops, they work from home, all the applications they're getting are off the internet themselves, all that authentication is happening up in the cloud, then putting the identities right next to those two processes starts to make more sense. So it's really an evaluation, but it's not just evaluation of those two pieces. Now we have IaaS, infrastructure as a service, and this is taking your on-premise data center hardware and software and moving it to another data center that you don't have to manage and own. We talked to a customer recently who was basically spending 50% of their time patching Windows servers, just simply going around and running update patches and scripts on all their Windows servers. It was sucking down their IT infrastructure. So the idea for them to be able to go to a hosted platform where somebody else patches the servers was a boon for them from a resource and from a budgeting standpoint. And you're allowed to basically spin up in any of these clouds Active Directory infrastructures, traditional LDAP directories, databases, applications. It really is a infrastructure as a service. I pick my operating system, I spin my platform up, I install my software up there. I still run the application layer, but I don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure. If you've seen the Oracle Cloud, let me know. I'm still looking for it. I don't see it very often anywhere, but I understand it exists. Because I was at Oracle World, and it was the second most popular word on every sign there was cloud after Oracle. So now that you kind of got an idea of where those endpoints are, is it a SaaS application? Am I moving my server infrastructure up there? Am I spinning up databases that I'm going to manage? Am I using someone else's platform for my data? What are you taking with you? What is going to go and what's going to stay? Because in reality, if you're a large, complex organization, you're going to be in a hybrid world for quite a while. And we're throwing that term around a lot now. I'm hearing it not only in hybrid in terms of on-premise data centers and cloud infrastructure, but now we're talking about hybrid clouds, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But the question becomes really what can go with you and what needs to stay behind. A lot of organizations are saying, well, from this point forward, everything is going to be cloud-based. And this has been a real boon for the identity market in that the companies have started to use that clout they have now to go to SaaS application developers and say, you need to be a SAML-aware application. You need to support OAuth. It's no longer, you're going to give me a web interface to hand type my user information into, and users are going to have to authenticate one application at a time. Because the early SaaS applications were simply on-premise applications that somebody stuck up on a server and said, hey, it's a SaaS app. It wasn't set up for SAML and for single sign-on, but now those applications are. So going forward, if you've got an on-premise application that does time reporting, you look for a SaaS application that does time reporting. You do a shootout on those, you find the one you like that meets your requirements, and then you just decide to move up to that or replace an initial system with that new platform. And that's a fairly easy model to move forward. And then you make decisions again about infrastructure behind that. But you may be replacing on-premise applications. You may be looking at places where you already have applications you've developed that you're running, and what is the lift to move those applications up? A lot of customers now have brought in dev teams to start to actually rewrite their internal applications to make them cloud aware, to make them cloud friendly, so that they can integrate those with their existing SaaS applications. So you end up with a hybrid of not only their SaaS apps and SAML-based and OAuth apps in terms of the way they authenticate, but they might be owned and rented applications. But now migrating on-premise applications to the cloud and federating your access, this again is taking those applications, rewriting that infrastructure and taking those up into the cloud. And then how are you going to migrate identities? How are you going to move the infrastructure you have on-premise up into the cloud? The other question is, what are you leaving behind? Because more than likely, you're not going to be able to lift the whole IT data department up into the cloud. So if you've got mainframes, if you've got a lot of Linux and Unix implementations, you have in-house applications, you have systems that are in your manufacturing environment that run machines, that run processes that you can't necessarily outsource or host, you need to understand where those are and what impact it's going to have in leaving those behind, and how do you integrate that model. If you've got web-based applications, the traditional CA, single sign-on, SiteMinder, ForgeRock, OpenAM, all those applications you reached over web services, or not web services, but a web application single sign-on platform, which was the bread and butter of single sign-on on the enterprise, those don't easily integrate with a SaaS application. They're not SAML-based. So if you're not rewriting them, are you going to leave them behind? Are you going to walk away from them? Or are you going to take them with you? And then AD domains, LDAP directories, databases, those again are not considered centric to the IDaaS model. If you look at the Okta model, it's one universal directory, which is a large database where all the identity information sits in one infrastructure. It's not a model that's akin to the multiple domain model we've constructed over the last 20 years. And there's been challenges with the multi-domain model. We built that to understand the requirements for local authentication for users when bandwidth was very slow and very difficult. But now if you look at Azure, Microsoft is going to ask you to consolidate all your AD domains down to one and move that up to the cloud. Do you have dependencies around those infrastructures? Are you going to still maintain and operate those? Are you still going to run those? And will authentication and authorization be processed locally or in the cloud, or a hybrid model? These are all things to consider as you sort of map out where you're going to go and be able to answer these particular questions. If you're going on a trip, you want to know what cities you're heading to. You want to know whether the weather's going to be good or bad. If you're moving from one house to another, you go room by room and decide what you're going to sell and what you're going to move, so you understand what you're taking with you and how big a truck to get. And then how are you going to sync changes? Because if you're in a hybrid model, if you have stuff that's still on premise and you have stuff in the cloud, things are going to change on both ends, and you need to keep that information in sync. If they're not in sync, now you're managing two worlds. And you can probably think back to a time in your career where you managed two disparate environments. You had domains that were not syncing, they were untrusted. The hassles of people coming to you saying, I got credentials, I know they're good, I cannot get in here where I'm supposed to get in with what I have. Well, yeah, you're using the credentials for the other unsynced environment. Of course you can't get in. What do you mean, of course I can't get in? Who built this thing? So you got to have that same challenge come back again when you start looking at these two models start to diverge if you don't have methods put in to put them into place. And then when are you making the move? Well, it's always yesterday. It's always the expectation that my competitor's in the cloud, why aren't we in the cloud? Or the cloud's been here for quite a long time, how come we're not in the cloud? And that question is almost thrown on the table like the cloud is one place that you just go to and arrive and unpack and you're there. As we saw though, you've got a lot to consider about which cloud you're going to, what you're going to do, how you're going to get there. So first, have the first three questions been answered? Have you gone through any kind of analysis of your environment to decide what this move really looks like? Have applications been surveyed? Have you actually gone through and looked to see what applications you have? And this can be a little scary because for a lot of IT organizations in the identity space, we gave service accounts out to the app dev team to say, hey, if you need access to AD to get authentication authorization, here's your endpoint. And they went off for the last 10 years and built applications using that endpoint. We have no idea what those applications are doing. If we unplugged AD, what would fall down? What critical systems have been built around this? And by the way, the guy who built that critical system, he retired 3 years ago. He's in Boca. He ain't answering the phone, and nobody else wants to touch it because if it breaks, they own it, and no one wants that responsibility or has any idea exactly how he got that funky thing working. So you really have to go through and start doing some application surveying to decide what kind of impact am I going to have? What do I have to replace? What do I have to hold on to? And then, as with any IT projects, a comprehensive project plan, a budget, and the one on the end there is key, a sponsor. This is a challenge for us in identity space because our projects are multi-year projects. If you really go deep into the organization, it takes 2 to 3 years to roll out a complete solution. Our sponsors in the executive branch last about 1.5 years, maybe 2. They may not make it to the end of the project. You may get a new guy who comes in and says, that was great, that wasn't my idea. We're not going to do my idea, which is a different idea than the last idea. So you really need to sort of build this project, if you can, as transfer proof or as promotion proof as possible and try to secure budget. One of the challenges here is boiling the ocean. I want to go to the cloud, take everything I have, and in 9 months be on the cloud. Or by 2020, be carbon footprint free. Whatever that big plan, that big boom model is, we've been in this business long enough to know that you don't get there in a one giant leap. You get there in incremental steps. You build your steps forward. You move systematically through the process to get ahead. So you need to have that comprehensive project plan, but it's going to be a phased plan. You're going to go for the low-hanging fruit up front. You're going to prove the value of the project and then move forward to the next layer. And what's the deadline? When is this when are we responsible for this? When are we going to get there? And I'm actually seeing some amazing pace in some of our customers and their ability to move a lot of applications and to get a lot of infrastructure up into the cloud. They're doing things now in months that we used to think would take years. So there is the capability of running at a fairly quick pace, but that pace is always a day behind because yesterday is always the deadline in most scenarios. So we may be heading to the cloud, but we're going to be living in a hybrid world for quite a long time. And that's really the underlying model I want to point out today is that everything you do, if you've got any particular size in your organization or complexity, it's going to take quite a long time to get everything off of the on-premise model and into the cloud if that's the direction you're heading. It may not be. Architecturally, financially, and just in terms of the way your infrastructure works, you may still be in a hybrid model for quite a long time. So you're really going to have one foot on the boat and one foot on the dock. And that's a bit of a perilous situation unless you really understand what each of those things means and what you need to do. So know where you're going, know where you started. The challenge here is understanding. We talked about the nature of cloud environments, knowing your terrestrial environment, and then understanding hybrid environments, as that's the world you're probably likely to be living in. As just to recap quickly, we have SaaS, IDaaS. Now, another area we're seeing a lot of is partner applications, where I'm now integrating applications that my business partner, my aligned competitor, frenemy, depending on the model or the job we're working on, they have applications they want to share with me. I need to give them access to my identity infrastructure. Or on the flip side, I've built all these wonderful applications. I want to offer them as a shared service to all the clinicians in my area because I'm a major hospital and I have now Epic available as a service and I'm now hosting and managing that. but I have to make it available to a lot of people outside my organization. So not only am I using SaaS applications, companies are now becoming the hosts for SaaS applications for other smaller entities. And this adds another layer to the whole cloud infrastructure. And then data center alternatives, are you actually looking at potentially hosting everything in the cloud? And we've got a number of customers that are making that move, that are moving to a cloud-only model. They're getting out of owning territory. They're getting out of owning actual physical buildings now. And with the combination you have of identity as an infrastructure as a service and infrastructure as a service, you can lift that whole data center out, again, as long as you don't have anchors that are left behind that you can't move or can't manage. And then we're moving to a world that is looking at actually deconstructing the whole application model. If you talk to anyone recently about microservices, the idea that I've broken my application down to little applets that spin up and spin down on AWS servers in a matter of seconds. I get a surge on reservations because Southwest announced a sale, and now I spin up another 5,000 servers on Amazon to handle the traffic that floods in over the weekend. All that information, all that infrastructure is a whole different model available now, because in a infrastructure as a service model, the backends are built to allow you to scale up and scale down dynamically. Where you wouldn't go to your CIO 5 years ago and say, yeah, I want to contract with Dell. We're going to buy 50 servers. We're going to use them for 3 weeks, and we're going to send them back. This wouldn't happen. It would take more than 3 months just to get 50 servers shipped into your organization. But in an infrastructure as a service model, you can do that. So that changes the dynamic now of how the model works. But you've got an underlying requirement here of the fact that microservices can be very dynamic, can be spun up and spun down as they're needed, but there's identity information that has to be both ubiquitous and available. You can't just create identity information out of the air. It's not an app front end that's generic. It actually has particular data. So you need to be able to build an infrastructure that allows you to synchronize and make information available now. And as you look at this graphic, in a hybrid cloud model. So we talked about hybrid as on-premise and in the cloud, but more and more now, we're talking about organizations that are doing a hybrid cloud. I'm going across multiple clouds. Well, what's my common format for data? What's my common infrastructure for data? What can I spin up in a Google environment that I can spin up in AWS and I can spin up on Azure? And when you have infrastructure as a service, if you build a common identity infrastructure, you can bring that into play. But just looking initially again at what you have, you've got a legacy infrastructure of databases, directories, Active Directory, legacy applications. You've got a n squared problem here where all these connections between all these systems and all these applications multiplied even more as you go to the cloud now. And what we're seeing with customers is a realization, I think after a few years, that each cloud endpoint is its own island of identity information. I have now provisioned my users into this cloud endpoint, and I may not even have visibility into those accounts. When somebody leaves the organization, I can tell they're terminated in HR. My provisioning system wipes them out of AD, no problem, archives them, renames their account. But I've got half a dozen SaaS applications where those accounts are still sitting there live, or if I even disable them, they're still getting license revenue for the SaaS vendor because I can't easily see that organization. I can't see that endpoint identity silo that I've created out there. So this model sort of multiplies itself over and over again. But if you actually flip the table here and change the model, instead of having all these endpoint connections, all this infrastructure integration to worry about in terms of adding a new hybrid layer, we've gone to a model of federating access. Let's bring all our applications into a single sign-on scenario, do that on-premise and in the cloud. The user's experience got a lot better. But to give that same benefit to your backends, to your sources, we suggest bringing in a layer of federated identity. Bring all your identity information together into a common model. Now, the challenge with a common model is, we tried this 10 years ago with meta directories, one size doesn't fit all. I can't build one identity infrastructure in one directory that's going to serve all the purposes I have for all my applications. And whoever owns that ends up being a bottleneck to anything I'm trying to do. So this layer in between all my sources of identity and all my consumers has to be flexible. It has to be a platform that can be many things to many people simultaneously. It has to be able to represent data in different protocols, schemas, structures, and different subsets of users based on what the applications need, so that each application has one place to go to get exactly the information it needs to authenticate, authorize that user, to allow you to build a risk-based model, allows you to go to zero trust. All those concepts we're seeing around security now are dependent on a rich identity infrastructure, but it needs to be something that's uniform and easily accessible. And the backends there all look very terrestrial, but in reality, those backends also now incorporate all your cloud infrastructure, because there's information in Azure, there's information in Salesforce. I need to make a reasonable authorization for someone's access to pricing information or financial data, or make sure that someone coming in from my external system over a broken iPad, a jailbroken iPad in a Starbucks, isn't accessing information either on an on-premise or in a cloud application. So I need to be able to build a uniform model. And what we find now is a really distributed infrastructure here, where I have what we call hublets, or hubs of identity information. I may have on-premise data, I may have cloud data, I may have information coming from partners, I may have information coming from other vendors. I'm pulling all that information together, and I need a set of tools to be able to integrate all that identity information together. And then again, on the top layer there, to be able to present that information exactly as it's needed. So I may have a hierarchical view because I've got an application that runs my worldwide sales organization that works on manager, direct report, or customer assignment and account management. I may have a geographical distribution for manufacturing, which is all based on the country of origin for that. But the identity information underneath this is all coming from multiple sources, so it needs to be able to be handled and managed in a very uniform manner, but presented in a very particular manner to those endpoints. And then again, as you look at this model, we're revisiting this here not just as a microservices scenario, but actually all the places within my cloud environments that I need to provide identity information, and my on-premise consumers of identity data. Again, that information needs to sync. I need to have methods and models for making sure that I have the right information in the right place. But now I've got regulations on top of that. I got GDPR that says I can't have information in Germany leave German territory. You can't host it in Ireland. I'm sorry. We've got companies in Australia that will not put information on American company hosted systems because the Patriot Act says the federal government can walk into that server with a warrant and take the data, and Australians have data privacy rules that say no foreign government can take our data. So they have to host in certain particular places. But that information needs to be available worldwide because these organizations are global in nature. So how do you do that? Well, you need a model that can represent information physically, but also can provide a proxy to a backend that can't actually be physically moved, but can be queried in real time and included in what appears to be a uniform view. You need to be able to make this information ubiquitously available without violating the requirements that you have for privacy and maintenance of that data. That requires an infrastructure that's highly developed, that has that synchronization and filtering capability, but it also requires a system that understands on a very granular level exactly what those user identities look like, exactly what that data is. So as we're moving to the cloud, we left behind all these challenges in the ocean, the bad weather, the reefs that we used to run into, all these little challenges that were part of the infrastructure that we grew up with. You've got orphaned accounts, you've got multiple different protocols that were not compatible, you've got the challenge of mining relationships and role management, you've got the legacy application haze at the bottom there. But what is a bit of a fallacy is the assumption that when all this evaporates, we leave behind the mess and we just take the gold with us up into the cloud. If you don't plan effectively, if you don't manage this process correctly, you're going to end up taking all the mess with you. Imagine if you sold your house and now you're moving to your new beautiful home and you told the mover, everything in the garage, it's going. Bring it with us. We're just going to put it in the new garage and deal with it never. That's what's going to happen if you just lift this into the cloud. So you have an excellent opportunity right now to take a look at what you have, to manage around that, to clean it up as much as possible, to be able to make that environment much more compatible to what you want to do. Now, the challenge with cleaning this up is, first of all, I have to understand what I have. So where's my information? What is it? Directories that is in? What databases are they in? What applications am I doing? As I mentioned earlier, this can be a challenge on just understanding where your infrastructure is. And because I've connected so many of my applications between provisioning and access management and governance to different backends directly, I don't have a simple platform to go to be able to understand all the dependencies that I've created, because it's a lot of it's out of my visibility, out of my control. But if you put in an abstraction layer, if you have a layer that sits in between all the consumers of identity and all the sources of identity, you now have the ability to see exactly what traffic and what information is flowing up and down your infrastructure. And if you know where information is coming from, you know where it's being consumed, you now have visibility into how to move and migrate that information, how to make that information available in other ways and other places. And most critically, you understand dependencies and relationships. You understand what's going to break. The migration model of let's just unplug it on Friday and see who calls on Monday is not really a model you can do more than once. So we want to actually know ahead of time what's going to happen. So when we make the flip over the weekend on Monday, nobody actually even knows. So part of that is understanding what applications require. And this is something that actually came back to us from a customer advisory board meeting. One of our customers stood up at actually Identiverse in Boston and said, it's amazing, we put Radiant Logic in between our applications and our backends, and simply by watching the logs, we could see every authentication, every authorization, every query, every group lookup, everything those applications were doing, and we're able, over to a pretty reasonable amount of time, map out a clear indication of what our infrastructure was. What wasn't being hit at all, what was critically dependent, what was being hit by the top 5 applications that we really cared about, actually understanding what that infrastructure looks like, because now you have somebody standing on the corner recording everything that goes by and making that available to you. And you can see very quickly where your sources of authentication and authorization are, how your federated access is working, and get a handle around when you have a single sign-on solution, what's actually coming back through that particular platform. And then once you've done that, you need to clean up that data. Again, this is an excellent opportunity to go through and clean house. Let's get rid of all the old furniture we don't want, just take the pieces that we really love and then get the new stuff that we want. But in order to clean that data, you have to have visibility, and then you have to see the commonality across those data sets. I may have a scenario where I've got 6 different platforms, and in each platform, somebody completed the state field differently. Someone put a capital C and a little a. Someone spelled out California. Somebody misspelled California. I've got all these variations. When I go and do a search across my environment under capital C, capital A, I get 20% of my data back because there's no uniformity there. So if you have an opportunity now to pull that information together and normalize that data. So what I'm going to move now is a clean set of data. Every state is 2 capital letters. Every phone number has been properly formatted. I'm masking certain data like social security number because I don't want that information to be available, but I need to be able to see that it's in the data set. Even something as simple as a company name. We've had scenarios where we built a view of the data that shows you all the variations of the company name in terms of the way it's been put into people's profiles. Cleaning that data up and then allowing you now to have a source of truth for that data gives you a platform to shift into the cloud. And as we mentioned before, all these cloud endpoints are actually identity silos that you're creating. You're provisioning your data into those endpoints. You don't want to provision the same mess up into your SaaS applications or into your identity as a service application. So you want to bring all that together. But that also includes aggregation and disambiguation. Because when you start talking about multiple sources of identity, directories, databases, LDAP backends, the cloud, you've got a tremendous amount of information that is in different formats, different structures. John Smith on one system and Jay Smith on another system may be the same person, but JS121 is a completely different person. You can't just merge things together willy-nilly. You have to have a process for understanding how to correlate that information, how to make sure that you're putting the right people together, because you want to build this one rich global profile that you can work with and build from. And then you've got to migrate that data. You've got to move that information up into the cloud, between AD domains within the cloud. You may be standing up an AD directory in Azure or AWS. to bring domain controllers into the cloud, although that still is a bit of an innocuous model for me because domain controllers were there to provide file server access. We use Dropbox now. To provide printer access, those are all wireless now. To authenticate me to my desktop, I do that with my local credentials. My need for domain infrastructure when I'm in the cloud is not the same. So just hauling it up there with you because I had it at home is maybe not the model to take, but it may serve some particular purposes. So again, question what you're doing, look a little bit deeper instead of just moving everything. Do I really need this? I think there's a lady on the internet who talks about how to clean up your life. If it doesn't give you bliss, then throw it away. If this isn't data you need, if it doesn't make you happy or make things function, let go of it if you can. Simplify. Especially moving databases up into the cloud. You've got a whole different infrastructure here, a whole opportunity to make that information available. So migration is key. You need tools that can actually move this data. Each cloud endpoint is a little bit different. Everybody has a different schema, a different structure. You might be talking to a Graph API. You might be talking to a Workday API. You might be talking to a SAML 2.0 backend. It really depends on the cloud infrastructure. We're getting better at unifying. We're not all in one model. I doubt we ever will be. So you need an infrastructure that can actually allow you to take one golden image and make it appear to be exactly in the format and the structure and the schema that each endpoint requires. But also at the same time, again, you're talking about multiple different languages potentially that have to be moved together. So you want to be able to do this in a way you can map your data information, you can use rules-based transformations, you can set this up once and hit the go button and roll this through your system over and over again with the ability to actually modify and move that model around as you need to. But also understanding that in the life cycle of this project, you're going to have a merger and acquisition, you're going to have a reorganization, you're going to have a new application come online. So it has to be a flexible platform. This has to be extensible, has to be adaptable to what you're doing. So you have to be able to make sure the system works well. And one of the key pieces here is password synchronization. We're still using passwords. We'll be using passwords. Passwords are like the mainframe. When I started in this decades ago, I was told the mainframe was dead. It's going to be gone in a year now. Well, it's decades later and the mainframes are still here. I heard at the same time we're getting rid of passwords. We're going to something else. We're still using passwords. So they're something we have to learn to live with, and there's something we have to learn to move to the cloud. So we have to understand where they're going to live. And my password's going to be on premise because my CIO isn't comfortable storing them in the cloud. So all of my authentications are going to be an up and down process, or at least a down process if I'm coming in from the cloud. Am I going to try and sync my passwords then? How do I do that? And if I get a password change someplace, how do I make sure it ripples through my whole environment? We spent years trying to synchronize passwords on premise across our applications and didn't get very far. Now we're adding a whole other layer of disconnected platforms. And if I'm federating access, that's great. Single sign-on for the end user, that's just more headaches for the IT department. How do I build those applications into my federated model? How do I do on-premise and cloud applications in a single sign-on model? And then how do I move data up and down? Because data is going to change. I got to maintain my data. So when something happens in AD, does it sync to Azure? Well, if you're using Microsoft's AD Connect, pretty confident it's going to move up there. It's going to be synced well because they built that in. If I'm using Okta and I want to pull information down from the cloud because I need it on premise, can I replicate that information down? Can I move the information both ways? And what's my source of truth? Because more than likely, I'm going to have multiple sources of truth now. I'm going to have some information that's sourced in the cloud. I'm going to have some information that's sourced on premise. So I've got bi-directional sync going on now. I'm creating this web of complexity around my data movements. But what I want to kind of impress here, and this is something that came out of Gartner Catalyst a couple years ago, the idea that we have one ecosystem here. We talk about on-premise in the cloud. We talk about a hybrid world, but it's really our world. It's the world we live in. The world we live in now has information in hosted environments, it has information in on-premise environments. Just like it used to be, well, there's stuff on the mainframe, there's stuff on the desktop. It's the same model. It's all stuff I own. So I have to look at this from a 360-degree view of my world. How is this information available to me? How do I access it? Where am I storing it? But I need to relate to it now, not as an us and them, not as two different groups. Because if you isolated IT, the on-premise folks from the cloud folks, it's like HR versus IT. You need to work together. These are all systems that are managing identity information. It's critical that these actually integrate together. And as you go through mergers and acquisitions, which is a real common play for most large organizations, in fact, the surge in the last 5 years has been almost exponential, you're going to now have to reintegrate a whole other set of on-premise and cloud infrastructure into your environment. So you need to be able to handle that throughout a reorganization, a divestiture. How do I spin out people from my cloud environment? Think about these things as you build going forward. And then what sort of model are you going to be in? Are you going to be in a perpetual hybrid environment? Are you going to be in a scenario where you're always going to have on-premise and cloud? If I've got medical devices in my hospital, they're going to be run on on-premise systems. I can't have a cloud application doing someone's heart monitor in my clinic, especially if it goes offline for half of the afternoon. So that information is still going to be on-premise. I'm going to have desktop systems that are going to have on-premise information. I've got homegrown applications, but I'm going to have more than likely a hybrid model. You may make a full cloud migration. If you've got less than 3,000 people, you started your company in the last 3 years, you're probably all cloud right now, because that was the obvious, easy choice to make. You may get to the point where all your applications end up in the cloud one way or another because of the nature of your business, you didn't have that. And you're able to sunset your terrestrial data centers and work in a fully hosted model. And that's an endpoint that many companies are working to get to and may well achieve. But now you've got also global distribution deploying across cloud data centers in multiple availability zones. Even if you're only cloud-based, you're going to have multiple places to think about. So you've got to understand, again, international borders, international requirements. You almost need a degree in international law now to be able to manage identity across the regulations that we're seeing. And now California has adopted their own privacy regulations, and we're not even completely sure yet how that's going to ripple out, what other states are going to take on those regulations, but it's going to control a lot of ways what kind of information can be stored off-premise or in the third party or someplace else. And also, just to sort of wrap up the cautionary tone I'll call at the end here is the pendulum swing of technology. And if you've been in the business long enough, you remember back in the 90s, early 2000s, there was a wave of outsourcing IT. A lot of large companies came to corporations, CIOs, CFOs, and said, hey, I'll take all your IT department, I'll take all that salary, all that training, all that upkeep, all that identity or employee management off your hands, and I'll turn around and I will give you a hosted IT scenario where I will rent back to you your own people. You don't have to worry about paying for them, you don't have to worry about anything, you just pay me a monthly recurring bill. You've got predictable costs, and I'll manage everything for you, and your IT infrastructure will work beautifully. And companies jumped at that. It was a great way to get rid of all this overhead because highly skilled IT infrastructure is complex and difficult, not understood at the executive suite. So we all rushed out and outsourced all of our IT infrastructure. And about 6 to 9 to 12 months later, my key people seem to have been transferred someplace else. The guy who knew that application like the back of his hand that I'd had with me for 10 years, he was now on another project because I didn't know him anymore and I couldn't keep him in my infrastructure. And now I started being told I have an 800 number that actually rings offshore for support I need for my infrastructure. If I need a new application spun up, I need to put it through the change control process and then work through all these bottlenecks. And I lost control of my IT infrastructure. I lost control of my folks and my environment. So a lot of companies realized after that swing, that wasn't necessarily a good thing. So they tried to rebuild their IT infrastructure. They tried to rehire the people. They canceled those contracts and moved away from that model. The challenge with that endpoint was those people are not there. Those resources were not available. They didn't have a program in place to spin that back up. So they end up in a scenario where now they're trapped in a much less than optimum model. And I caution that in the cloud migration scenario. It's a wonderful world. It's not unicorns and rainbows. It's not necessarily going to be everything and all. And potentially, given the way that IT works, there'll be a swing back. There'll be a point at which people start bringing information down from the cloud and back onto terrestrial environments. So integrate that concept into your model. Understand that everything I'm doing today isn't a cut the line and once I'm at the sea, I'm not coming back, but leave that bridge in place. Leave that understanding of how would I back this out. If you've ever done a server upgrade, if you've done it well, you sat there and documented before you did it exactly how you're going to back out this upgrade. So if it goes badly, you want a way to get back to where you were. This is the city of Paris. The city of Paris is actually now pulling their data off the cloud, off of hosted environments, and back into their own data center. One of their challenges was that the cost of that hosting was becoming onerous, and every 3 years they'd have to renegotiate a new contract, and the vendor knew they had them because I have all your information in my infrastructure. I can double my price. What are you going to do? Take it back? So Paris said, yeah, we'll take it back. Gave them greater data privacy, greater cost control, greater long-term stability, because they have 10 and 12-year and 15-year programs now in terms of their model. And they actually invested in a more green model. For them internally as the city of Paris, they wanted to be an infrastructure where the heat generated by the servers is actually provided to the apartment buildings in the neighborhood as a source of heat for them to keep that carbon footprint actually reused in their environment. So it's already starting to happen in sort of peripheral models. Keep that in mind as you go through it. But I want to thank you all for listening to my suggestions around how to get to the cloud and what to think about in going that direction. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for anybody that has those or give you my opinion. Yes?
One comment you made early on is that it doesn't make sense to authenticate users in the cloud to use on-prem services. But you kind of sounded like you were leaning more on the latency as being the problem there. Do you see this as a security issue as well with mastering identity in the cloud to get to on-prem services?
Well, it's twofold. One, latency is the one the first thing I get to, because the end user, the customer, they've got 230 milliseconds before a end user starts to feel frustrated that he's waiting too long for something to happen. We've created a model with Google Speed now and Amazon Experience where people expect everything to work magically. So when you add latency to a system, it adds frustration. People will complain, and if enough people complain in an organization, changes come from the top down, not based on technology, but based on perception. But that goes back to the earlier comment I made when I first started in this business. The prediction was no one would put secure information in the cloud. No one would put passwords up there or financial information in the cloud. People are. The willingness to trust that vendor is doing the right things, secures his environment, has all the infrastructure in place. The janitor can't walk around at night and flip keyboards over to access people's accounts. All that's assumed that all the things I couldn't control on my on-premise is magically taken care of in the cloud. If that assumption is made, then you don't think about security. But it's something I would add into my model. In a very well-managed infrastructure in the cloud, you've got legally binding contracts and SLAs and audits, and somebody goes and visits their site and someone walks around. You vet that endpoint. But I doubt that most companies have the time or the infrastructure or the people to go out and vet all the SaaS vendors that you're throwing information on. If you're on NetSuite, and I'm not saying anything positive or negative about NetSuite, but you've got financial data on NetSuite. If you're in Salesforce, your customer information, including how much your product costs, are sitting in Salesforce. So you should be concerned about security. And if you can minimize that vector, you should. One of the things I started mentioning years ago, and it didn't really get very far, was if I move all my security infrastructure, all my defense, all my virus scanning, all my denial of service infrastructure to the cloud because they've got a nice SaaS service for all that functions, and somebody wants to attack me, they simply block my internet access. They flood all my ports to the internet. Now all my commanders are separated from their tools and they can't do anything to fight the attack because they're now cut off from anything they had to understand what was happening, to try and mitigate it. They're defenseless at that point. So understand that you are creating more vectors for attack at that point, and decide whether or not that information is something you want to put there. Yeah. And again, these are all my opinions, by the way. I'm just yes, sir.
So you mentioned about hybrid, right? Cloud and on-site.
Yeah.
But there's also hybrid in terms of federation, right? So if you have so many cloud services available, especially the Microsoft and non-Microsoft world, how we differentiate. Is it common to have a hybrid solution, especially on the federation side for Microsoft and non-Microsoft?
We're seeing a lot of that. And it's sort of different groups within the organization made decisions to buy different products. I've been in places where you ask a company, well, what do you have for single sign-on? Oh, we have one of everything. And what do you do? We're going to Microsoft Azure for Office 365, but we're using Okta for Salesforce. Well, Microsoft Azure could do Salesforce. Why'd you stand up two infrastructures? Well, we did. So yeah, we're seeing that quite a bit. We're seeing a lot of deployment of multiple infrastructures. Less so in the terms of it's more in the big players. Well, we're seeing this also. We're seeing people standing up a lot of infrastructure in Azure, but all the dev people are over in AWS. So all my identity information, my office working, my back office is in Azure. All my app dev and all my other work is in AWS. And now all my analytics and all my AI work is being done in the Google Cloud. So we're seeing that multi-cloud distribution quite frequently, and multiple platforms doing the same thing. You may be doing AI in AWS, you're doing AI in Google, two different departments, two different reasons. And we saw that before on the on-premise world, where we had multiple single sign-on platforms, or we had 4 different financial backends, or just even HR. If you talk to a company about, how many HR platforms do you have? Oh, 7, well, 12 if you count Contractors, because they've acquired companies and they just basically never tried to consolidate anything. So that's a fairly common model. Yep. The question was, is anybody looking at actually moving your AD domain structure onto AWS? Are you spinning up an AD domain in the AWS infrastructure so you're getting AD Kerberos authentication there? So that's an interesting question, though, because you're looking at 2 different flavors of world, from a cloud-based being a very disconnected model in most scenarios. It's a source and an endpoint that if they can talk to each other, they're responsible for managing that conversation, where the Active Directory domain model was very much, I will manage all this for you. You just come to me and I'll handle everything behind that.
So if you're doing what they like to call lift and shift, which is not really lift and shift, you may be able to justify building a resource domain that is public cloud facing, that you then leverage your on-premise accounts to manage IaaS resources in public cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some scenarios where that makes sense.
Yep.
But in general, I would port Active Directories as well.
Mm-hmm.
Even Microsoft, I don't believe long term, believes that on-premise Active Directory is strategic.
Yeah, my perception is that Microsoft has gone all in on the Azure environment. Azure B2B and Azure B2C are where they want your identity information stored.
I'm not even so sure about those plays
Yeah.
that exist today, but yeah.
Yeah, and there is a undercurrent to this whole thing that vendors figured out a long time ago. If I have your identities, I have you to some degree. It's a territorial move. Microsoft focused wholly on migrating everyone to the cloud from their AD environment, at least be in a hybrid model, and they used Office 365 to pull everybody up there. And that's part of the reason I think the perception is that I use Okta for Salesforce and I use Azure for Office 365, because that was the drum they beat. And they did it very effectively, and they got most customers moving that direction, understanding that once I have your identities in Azure, now I have a recurring revenue model, I can now offer you more services, and I can incrementally add on to your bill with additional features and functions you realize you need once you've gotten there.
And provide you services that would be cost prohibitive to provide on-premise for yourself.
Yes, exactly. And that's a big part of the SaaS application model and the move to the cloud is you're getting access to services you couldn't spin up. If you're a company of 500 people and you're using Salesforce, you're using the equivalent of a $1 million infrastructure for access management to your customers. It's an amazing tool that you can get for $500 a month. So the opportunity here to get quality at scale down to the masses is amazing within the cloud infrastructure. It's been a boom for the industry. It's just, it comes with all of its associated considerations. All right, I think we're at the end of our hour. Thank you, everyone.